Narayana Samarambam Vyasa Shankara Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam Vasudevendra Yogindram Natva Jnana Pradam Gurum Mumukshunam Hitartaya Tattva Bodho Vidiyate. In the last video, we started our discussion about the three states and discussed both the waking and dream state. Just to kind of go over that again real quick, one of the main things to understand about this teaching of the three states, which is based on the Mandukya Upanishad, is that it shows you the person you think you are, which is generally the waking state entity. The person you are, the person you seem to be when you're awake, is the one that we commonly identify with. And people are not normally going to say that they believe that they're the person that appears when they dream. Now, granted, a lot of the time when you dream, you do think you are that person at the time, but upon waking, that identification is broken. So the question here, what we're asking is okay, if you are this waking state entity or dream state entity, whichever one, how can that be possible if that entity is not always present? If you are the waking state entity, setting aside the fact that the waking state entity is an object known to you and is constantly changing, which negates its reality and negates the fact that it can be you in the first place. Putting that aside, how could you be the waking state entity if it disappears when you dream and is replaced by the dream state entity? Or how could you be the dream state entity if it disappears when you wake up and it's replaced by the waking state entity? And furthermore, how could either one of those entities be you if both of them disappear when you go into deep, dreamless sleep? And that's the main point here of this teaching, is to show that you can't be this person that you're identified with, along with the logic that I previously laid out, about that person being an object known to you, that object constantly changing. You can't be that person for those two reasons, but you can't be that person either because that person continuously blinks in and out of your experience. Say the waking state person's there, you lay down in your bed, and then boom, gone. Dream state entity appears. Or you lay down and boom, the waking state entity totally disappears in deep sleep. So for that reason, you can see that you can't be this person that you think you are, because that person is not always present. If you were one of those entities, which one would you be? Are you the deep sleep when it's totally gone? Are you the dream entity? Are you the waking state entity? Well, the truth of the matter is that you can't be any of those entities. Those are all objects that are known to you. And the truth of the matter is that to be able to say that those entities even come and go, you have to be there you have to be present and unchanged in order to report that something had changed. I may have used the example before about being at a party. I can't say when someone showed up, how long they were at a party, and when they left if I wasn't there before they arrived, while they were there, and after they left. If I showed up to the party after they had arrived, I couldn't say when they got there. If I left the party while it was still going on and then came back, I couldn't say whether or not the person actually stayed at the party or not. And if I left before they left, I couldn't say that they did leave. I'm not really sure. But unlike that party situation, you can say, hey, the waking state entity showed up. It stayed around for a while, and then, it disappeared, and the dream state entity came. And then it totally disappeared, and there was nothing, there was no experience of either one of them for a while, and then boom, the waking state entity came back. The only way that you can say that is if you exist and are present and unchanged in order to be able to witness the coming and going of those different states, the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state. So that's really the bottom line of it. The problem comes in when people say, oh, well, that's all fine and well, but then, what am I instead? You say I'm this consciousness, I'm the self, I'm existence, but I don't seem to exist in deep sleep. How do I know that I'm still there? So that's what we're actually going to talk about today, is the deep sleep state. And this is somewhat of a tricky topic, and it requires a little bit of logical thinking. One thing I will say right off the bat is that have an open mind about this. I find that when people go into this inquiry with a closed mind, they're just totally convinced that they don't exist when they sleep, or there is no way to know that they exist in sleep. Then they just totally close themselves off to it, and all they want to do is argue with me. Even when they're arguing with me, they're not really arguing with me. They're arguing with the logic of the teaching. And the logic of the teaching is airtight. I mean, it's very thorough. It goes very in depth. And there's not really an argument that you can pose against it. So if you can't see how you exist in deep sleep, it's not a matter that you've proven the teaching wrong. It's that you just haven't understood the teaching properly. And I don't say that to be a jerk or, be confrontational. I'm just saying I've had enough people argue with me at this point that I can say that this whole thing, this whole inquiry works a lot better when you just have an open mind. You conditionally accept what the scripture says, that you do exist in deep sleep, and you try to resolve your doubts from that standpoint, rather than totally believing in your doubts up front, saying, oh no, I don't exist in sleep, end of story. Rather than doing that, if you approach it with an open mind, it makes this inquiry a lot easier. Okay? So that being said, that's my little disclaimer right there. Let's go ahead and go to the scripture and see what it has to say about the deep sleep state. What is the deep sleep state? It is the state when both the gross and subtle bodies are not present and only the causal body remains. Since there is no subtle body available to facilitate thought or perception, then all objects, including time and space, are absent. Therefore, no problems exist in deep sleep. Hence, upon waking, you say, I remember that I did not perceive anything. I experienced limitlessness. When the self seems to identify with the causal body, it is called the sleeper. Okay, so there's a lot of information here. Right off the bat, it just says, hey, what is the deep sleep state? It's the state of experience when the gross and subtle bodies are not present and only the causal body remains. Okay, that's pretty obvious. I mean, when you're in deep sleep, the person that you seem to be, meaning the body and the mind, or a combination of the body and the mind, just isn't there. No one's physical body or mind is present in deep sleep. They tend to disappear. And again, this is why people think they don't exist in deep sleep, but we'll talk about that again in a minute. So the gross body's not there. The subtle body's not there. That's obvious. Only the causal body remains. Now, before we talked about the 3 bodies and the 5 sheaths, and we talked about the causal body being equal to ignorance, limitlessness, etc. And we're going to talk about that now because we didn't really talk about it before. So we said before that the causal body is the unmanifest or seed state. It's like the potential information for all objects is in the causal body. So in the waking state, those objects, that information or potential has manifest as the objects known as your body and your mind. When you're in the deep sleep state, all of those objects have withdrawn into the causal body and they're in their potential formless seed state. So Basically what that amounts to is that the causal body is essentially always present. I mean, the gross body and the subtle body can come and go, but the causal body is actually there all the time. And the potential for objects is always there. Now, we can't, so based on that, we can't use the logic that if something isn't always present, then it's not real. Okay, we can't apply that to the causal body because for all intents and purposes, the causal body is always present because the objects are either present in their manifest form or they are in their unmanifest potential form. You know, we can kind of see a parallel here with science. I mean, science says that matter cannot be either created or destroyed. Okay, so when the body and mind disappear in sleep, it's not like they're destroyed, they just change form. They just go into a potential unmanifest formless form, so to speak. All right, so on that basis, we can't ever say for sure that the causal body is not present. It's always there, but it's either manifesting something or not manifesting something. However, we can negate the reality of the causal body by inference. Okay? We can't experience the causal body directly as an object. Okay? It's not an object. It's the essence or cause of all objects. However, we can learn about the nature of the cause of something based on the effect. And what we can say for sure is that the effects of the causal body, meaning the gross body, the mind, the dream state, all of those things which are effects of the causal body, it's plain to see that they are constantly changing. So we can infer based on the effects of the causal body that the causal body itself changes. And on that basis, we can definitely negate the reality of the causal body because what? Because what changes cannot be real. So using just that basic inquiry, we can also negate the causal body as being us. Okay? We may not see it directly or experience it directly, but since it's always present, one might be led to say, well, maybe I'm the causal body. You're not, because the causal body, through inference, we can see based on its effects that it constantly changes. So therefore, it cannot be real. So the causal body always remains because objects are either there in their manifest or unmanifest causal state. But the causal body itself is dynamic and changing, so it cannot be you, the unchanging self. So, since there's no subtle body available to facilitate thought or perception, then all objects, including time and space, are absent. Okay, so your typical means of experience when you're in deep sleep, it's not there. And your body's not there, so your physical equipment is not there. So obviously you're not able to interact with the physical world. I mean, the physical world's not there either when you sleep. So there's not a physical world there to experience, nor is there a physical instrument there to experience it. So you're not going to be touching anything in deep sleep because there's nothing to touch and there's nothing to touch it with. So the external world, the body, they're not there. The mind isn't there either. I mean, without the mind, you can't have experience. I mean, you could have an external world, you could have a physical instrument, but without the subtle body, there can't be experience. Think of a dead body, for instance. A dead body is not experiencing anything because it has no subtle body. The subtle body has departed from the physical frame. So with no subtle body, there's no organs of perception. Okay? The physical counterparts, as we said, like your eyeballs, like your skin, like your ears, your nose, your tongue, those things are in the physical frame, but the organs of perception are actually in the subtle body. So the point being that when you are in deep sleep, the instrument of experience that you're normally used to having is not there. So because of that, there's no objects, okay? And that includes time and space, because time and space are objects that are known to you. They are objects of your experience. So we can definitely say that the person that you think you might be is not there in deep sleep. And this is what leads a lot of people to say, well, I don't exist then in deep sleep because I'm not experiencing any objects. However, does not experiencing or perceiving objects mean that you don't exist? And that's something that we're going to kind of talk about in just a minute. I'm going to say right up front, no, it doesn't mean that. You definitely exist and you're definitely conscious in the presence or absence of any objects. But we'll go into the logic of that in a few minutes. So, since the subtle body's not there, there's no thoughts, no perceptions, including the perception of time and space, okay? Therefore, no problems exist in deep sleep. This is a fact. I mean, where do your problems exist? They exist when objects are present. They exist because you have a sick body. They exist because you have a disturbed mind. They exist because there's a problem at work. They exist because there's a problem with your relationship with your spouse or your friend or family member. There is a problem with your car. There's a problem with your bank account. These are all objective problems. Okay, you're limited by time. Everybody is always watching the clock, never have enough time. You're limited by space insofar as if the body's here, it can't be over there, for instance. You have spatial limitations. You have time limitations, temporal limitations. And you have any of the other limitations that come with having a body, having a mind, or having a life. Right? But when you sleep, those objects are not there. So there's no problems in deep sleep. This is why depressed people sleep a lot. You know, I used to suffer from depression years ago. And, you know, you would want to try to sleep because when you go to sleep, there's no problems there. A good friend of mine was also very depressed, and all he would do most of the time was sleep all day long. You know, maybe he didn't realize it at the time, but it was because when you sleep, all of the problems of the external objective world are not there. Right? And this is part of the reason that people want to sleep in general, whether you're depressed or not, is because when you sleep, all of the world disappears temporarily. So therefore, no problems exist in deep sleep. Hence, upon waking, you say, I remember that I did not perceive anything. I experienced limitlessness. Now this is why the causal body can be called the experience of limitlessness or bliss. You know, we talked about the causal body as the Anandamaya kosha, and we say it's the bliss sheath. Well, bliss is really the experience of limitlessness. You know, at that moment, you don't feel particularly limited by anything. Like when you get what you want, you feel limitless because you're not at that moment feeling limited by your lack of that object. Just say you want a pile of money or whatever, you know, a plate of food. Say you're hungry, you really want some food. At that moment, you are limited by the limitations of your physical body. You're limited by the fact that you don't have food. You're uncomfortable and limited by the presence of the desire for food because, you know, desire is uncomfortable for the most part. It's pointing to the fact that you lack something, that you are limited by the absence of that thing. So you get the plate of food. What happens? There's no separation anymore between you and what you want. Your desire goes away. All the problem itself goes away, and temporarily you feel bliss or happiness because you're not limited by any kinds of desires or problems. Okay? The penultimate experience of that is when you sleep, because there's absolutely no problems, absolutely no objects, no desires, nothing. So when you sleep in the absence of those objects, you experience limitlessness. Now that we've kind of talked about that, let's kind of lead into the logic here of why you actually exist in deep sleep. Okay? For sure, definitely, your body and your mind are not present in deep sleep, but it doesn't mean that you're not there in deep sleep, because we're saying that you are consciousness, existence, you are the self. And people say, well, I don't exist in deep sleep. Well, first and foremost, we can say there's a lot of ways to look at this, and I'll try to go over a few of them. We want to sleep. You need to sleep. You have to sleep. Now, when you go to sleep and wake up the next day, you say, I feel rested. Most of the time. Okay? Most of the time you say, hey, I feel rested. Now, if you don't exist in deep sleep, so that means that there's a non-existent entity, and a non-existent entity cannot have any kind of experience. But if you go to sleep feeling tired and then wake up feeling rested, how can you say that you're non-existent in sleep? Because a non-existent entity cannot be changed or modified by a non-existent experience. Okay? So on that basis, you can see it's a reasonable argument to see that you must exist in deep sleep. Granted, I'm talking about the apparent you. You must exist in deep sleep because you were changed from a tired person to a rested person. You had to have been there having some kind of experience in order to be changed from tired to rested. Now granted, like I said, from this perspective, I'm talking about the apparent person being there to some degree. We're going to talk about you being there as consciousness, existence, in just a moment. All right, so if you can follow the logic and see that you must be having some kind of experience in sleep, and that sleep can't happen to a non-existent entity, then you can say, all right, well, I must exist to some degree in sleep in order to have this experience that modifies me from being tired to being rested. Here, the following question, though, and well, actually, before we go into that, we were talking about the existence of the apparent you. Now, this is something that you have to take on board as a matter of faith or having an open mind. Okay, this is what the scripture says. The scripture says that you are not there, okay, as the normal experiencing entity. Right? We just said that. We said your body and your mind is not there, so you don't experience objects. However, if we say that you have an experience in sleep, and it is obvious that you do, otherwise you wouldn't change from rested or from tired to rested, there has to be some kind of experiencing entity there in order to have that experience. What the scripture says is that there is a rudimentary form of the ego there, and it's called the avidya vritti or the nidra vritti. Avidya means ignorance, nidra means sleep. So the ignorance thought or the sleep thought. There's a rudimentary ego there, a rudimentary vritti or thought that is available to have that experience. And what is that experience? Is it an experience of a particular object? No, it's actually the experience of the absence of objects, and that is what makes it blissful, because it's a limitless experience where you don't have time, you don't have space, you don't have all of the objects that cause you problems. Okay, so that's what the scripture says, is that there is a rudimentary form of the ego or the experiencing entity there in order to facilitate the experience of limitlessness in sleep, and that is how you modify from one kind of thing to the other. So that answers the question of, does the apparent you exist in some form when you sleep? And that's the answer there that the scripture provides. Now, without the scripture, without having to take the scripture on faith, we've already seen that sleep has to be some kind of experience, even if it's the absence of experiencing particular objects. Now, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, is experience possible without consciousness? Can an unconscious entity have an experience? And the answer there would logically have to be no. If you have an experience, there has to be consciousness in order to facilitate that experience. Okay, so we've said that the apparent you exists in some form. Okay, so we've got the apparent waking you, the apparent dream you, and the apparent deep sleep you. We have all these apparent entities, and we've seen why those things cannot be you. But we're saying here, now, what about the real you? What about the self? Now, if we can see that there's an experience in deep sleep, and that experience can't be experienced, can't happen without consciousness, then that shows you that as the self, you are definitely present in deep sleep, because what is your nature? Consciousness. Now, a lot of the times people get the functioning of their mind, the perception of objects, mixed up with consciousness, but they're not the same thing. Okay? In the West, in medicine, in psychology, we tend to define consciousness as the functions of your mind. If your mind is functioning, you're conscious. If you're perceiving objects, you're conscious. If you're thinking thoughts, you're conscious. We're saying that all of those functions of the mind, all of the thoughts of the mind, those are objects known to consciousness. They are not themselves conscious. So people say, well, I can't be conscious if I'm not conscious of something. And that is not the case. Consciousness is in the presence or absence of objects. And hopefully you can see that by this example of deep sleep. There's an experience of limitlessness happening in deep sleep. There's the experience of the absence of objects. And this experience only happens because of the presence of you, the self, consciousness. Okay? So that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is to analyze the fact that you want to go to sleep. Maybe I already said this, but this is another way to look at it. You know, why, if deep sleep is non-existence, would you want to go to sleep? Why would you consciously try to sleep, make time to sleep, buy a nice bed, wash your sheets and lay down and turn off the lights and draw the shades if you were going to be non-existent? Essentially, non-existence is death. You know, people may not be scared of death, but even people that aren't scared of death aren't exactly running around trying to find their death, because what's the problem with death is that it seems like it is non-existence. Okay? So essentially then, death and sleep would be the same thing if you actually don't exist in sleep. I mean, they say sleep is the cousin of death. They're like a degree removed, because, essentially people seem to think that they don't exist in sleep. But if you don't want to die, I mean, why would you want to sleep? You actually want to sleep. And that, if it's non-existence, then you're saying, well, every night I want to not exist. And nobody does that, because your own existence is the most dear thing to you. So that's another indication of the fact that you do actually exist in deep sleep. Granted, the person that you think you might be, the body and the mind, is not there. That is completely true. But it doesn't mean that you, meaning consciousness, the self, are not there. You are very much there, because you'd have to be there in order to report the absence of objects. You say, I don't remember anything. Well, I don't remember anything means I didn't experience any particular objects. The example that I like to use is to say, well, was I at your house yesterday? Was Vishnudeva at your house yesterday? If you definitively say no, Vishnudeva was not at my house, how would you be able to do that? If you weren't home, could you definitively say that I wasn't at your house? No, you could not. You would have to be home to say that I wasn't at your home. And you have to be present to experience my absence in order to say that I wasn't there. And it's a similar situation, whichever way you want to look at it, from the apparent sense of the avidya vritti or the nidra vritti, the rudimentary ego that's experiencing limitlessness, or from the standpoint of consciousness, because if the avidya vritti is experiencing limitlessness, consciousness has to be there. Okay, so you have to be present. You have to exist in order to experience the absence of objects in order to say that there was the absence of objects, similar to the way that you actually have to be at your house at a particular time to experience the absence of Vishnudeva to be able to say that Vishnudeva was not there. Okay, there is another way to look at it, to see that you have to be present in deep sleep. You may not be present in the way that you think you are. Okay, you're not there as the body, you're not there as the mind. This is true, but you are definitely there as consciousness existence. Now, maybe I've touched on this before and maybe I haven't. I kind of forget after doing all of these videos. But if I haven't said it before, consciousness and existence are the exact same thing. The definition of the self used in the scriptures is Sat, Chit, Ananda. Okay? Sat, well, let's see, Chit means consciousness. We've already established that. Consciousness is the nature of the self. Sat, existence, being, or isness, is also the nature of the self. So we're saying that those two things are the exact same thing. Now, before I go into anything deeper here, let's just use this example right off the bat. You have someone and they say, I do not exist in deep sleep. That's a fact of that, I am sure. It's a matter of my own experience. I know that I am non-existent in sleep. All right, let's analyze that statement. What's the implication of saying, I don't exist in sleep? I am non-existent in sleep. The implication is that you are saying that non-existence, there actually is such thing as non-existence, right? In order to say that you're non-existent in sleep, you have to prove that there is such thing as non-existence. Now, if there is such thing as non-existence, what have you just done? You've just affirmed the existence of non-existence. And therefore, you can see that there can't really be any true non-existence. I mean, if you say there's such thing as the void, or the nothing, or non-existence, or nothingness, however you want to phrase it, then you are implying the actuality of non-existence, or the void, or nothingness. Now, if you're doing that, does that non-existence or nothingness exist or not exist? If it doesn't exist, then there's no such thing as non-existence. And if it exists, then again, there's really no such thing as non-existence, because non-existence exists and therefore would be existence. Okay? So maybe that's a little bit of a convoluted logic, but think about it. To actually say that there's non-existence, then you're saying, if you say non-existence is, the is existence. The isness of everything is existence. And that's going to be the final point here, talking about existence itself. Now, we say the nature of the self is consciousness. We say the nature of the self is existence. Now, why use two different words? Well, it's truly just an arbitrary distinction, and it's based on what perspective you're looking at the self from. Not that you can actually look at the self, not that you can actually look at the self from over here and look at the self from over there, okay? We're just talking about different ways to think of the self and investigate the self, all right? So, internally, mentally, we talk about the self as consciousness. We talk about the self as being the witnessing consciousness of our minds, of our thoughts. And we can say, all right, there's these objects that are known to me. I must be the consciousness, the conscious subject in which they appear, to whom they are known. Okay? When we investigate the self from an internal perspective, from inside the mind, we can think of it most easily as consciousness. It's easy to see that the self must be the witness of these objects, because it's plain that the objects are known to you. And if they're known to you, then there has to be something that knows them, and we envision that as consciousness. But what about the external world? When we talk about the external world and investigate the self, we call it existence. Because in actuality, there's not the self plus the external world. We're saying there's only the self. So how do we investigate and see the self in the external world? Now, granted, you can't ever really show that there's an external world, because all that you ever experience at any given time is the contents of the thoughts in your mind. You can't ever say, well, here's a world outside of my mind, because anything you ever point to is actually just a perception in your own mind. So, as I said, these distinctions are a bit arbitrary, but this isn't easy for people to see initially. So internally, mentally, in the mind, we say, okay, the self is the consciousness in which these objects appear. Externally, outside of the mind, because at first it definitely appears that there is a definitive external world, we see the self as existence. Okay? And existence and consciousness are the exact same thing. Now, you might say, well, how can we see the self? You said it's not an object. When I look at the external world, all I see is objects. Now, this much is true. But I will show you that existence itself is not an object. All that you ever see outside of the mind, the external objects, granted, I just said that there's no world outside of the mind, but it appears that way. So I'm just talking about the appearance. So these external objects, we can say when we see the external objects, we're seeing what? Are we seeing existence as an object, or are we seeing name and form? What we're actually seeing is name and form. And that's all that we're seeing as an object. Existence is evident, but it's not known directly as an object. And I had an example worked up to explain this, but maybe we'll just use, instead of you having to imagine this example, let's just take a look at this video right now. Okay? So you see this. You see this body and mind. You see some pictures. You see a wall. You see a bookshelf and some more pictures, etc. There's all different kinds of objects right now in this video. Now, what are you experiencing? You're experiencing name and form. Okay? Vishnudeva. That's a name. It refers to a form, okay, this particular face and these glasses and this beard and this shirt and these arms and everything like that. We can say picture. Okay, picture refers to a particular, is a name that refers to a particular form here. It has a color, it has a shape. You can say Ganesh. You can say altar. You can say bell, candle, whatever. Okay, we have all kinds of names and all kinds of forms. That's correct. But let's investigate these names and forms to see what exactly, to see how we can know the self in objects as existence. Okay? So you can look at me, and we've said that there's the name, Vishnu, there's the form, the body, and look at, say, this picture right here of my guru, James Schwartz. And so there's Vishnu, there is this picture, and then there's like a table right there. Now, the name is definitely different. Vishnu, picture, table. Correct? Those things are different. Those are objects of your experience. The form is definitely different. Okay, the form of this body is definitely different than the form of that picture and the form of that table. That too is also true. However, is the existence of this body, the existence of that picture, and the existence of this table different? No, it isn't. We say the body is. The body exists. The body has being. The picture is. The table is. Granted, the color, the shape, the name, the form, however you want to look at it, that definitely differs. But does the existence of each one differ? No. they both equally share, all three of these objects equally share existence. Now again, you might say, but that's an object known to me. No, it isn't. Existence is not an object because it has no name and it has no form. Existence, when you say name is, form is, existence is the essence of that name. It itself has no name. Existence itself has no form because it is the essence of all forms. It exists everywhere, equally, at all times. Can you ever point to anything at any time and say that existence is not present? You can't. This video exists. The room that you're in exists. Your body exists. Just think of your life as a continuous change of experiences. Just one experience goes and another experience comes. The experience is different. The name and the form of each experience is different. What's the same? Existence. This experience that I'm having is. Now this experience that I'm having is. This experience that I'm having is. The past is. The present is. The future is. Any of those things at any time, any place. You go to the far reaches of the galaxy, and if the far reaches of the galaxy is, then it exists. Existence is already there. Okay? And the existence itself is not an object because only the names and the forms are objects. The essence of the name and forms has no name and has no form. Let's look at it a little bit more here. We said the existence of Vishnu is the same as the existence of that table, the existence of that picture. The particulars of the name and form differ, but the isness, the being, the existence of each object is the same. And as I said, that existence is never not present. Okay? If you say deep sleep is non-existence, then you imply that non-existence is. Non-existence exists. So existence is there in deep sleep as well, and you are that existence. There's no difference. There's no place existence isn't, and there's no difference, no name and form to that existence. You can look at it again a little bit further here. Look at Ganesh, look at the other pictures, look at the wall, look at all of these objects here. You see the names and you see the forms, but equally the objects are, or the objects is, to use poor grammar, okay, for lack of a better term here. The objects is, all right? So the names and forms definitely differ. That picture is gold, that bookshelf is blue, that book is red, that book is yellow, this tablecloth is pink, whatever. All of those things differ, but the existence of them do not differ. So equally, existence is. Existence is formless because it has no particular form. It's the essence of all forms. And it's equal in each thing. If you can see the existence in all of these objects, ask yourself one more thing. Where do these objects exist? In space. And space is or isn't. Space is. So every possible object, from the objects themselves to the space that they're in, all exist. So existence is ever present, formless, and nameless. And you can see that externally in these objects. Again, there's no real difference between the internal and the external, but at different stages of inquiry, it's helpful to look at it that way. Inside the mind, we can say, oh yeah, I'm the self, the consciousness in whom these objects appear. But when you look externally, you can say that, oh, I'm the existence of all of these objects. Technically, you can say, well, the contents of my mind are, they exist. My thoughts are, my thoughts is. Okay, so you can say equally there that you can see yourself as existence in the mind too. Right? So all of the names and forms themselves have no actual existence. You can't experience them, so they have a strange level of existence that we call neither existent truly or truly non-existent. They're mithya, right? But this is why we say that all objects depend on you to exist, because you are existence itself. You are the essence of all objects. They can only, for any name and form to be, any attribute, any shape, any color, they have to have some kind of essence. They have to have some kind of substratum to depend on. And what we're saying here is that you are existence itself. And all of these objects depend on you for their apparent existence. And this is why you definitely exist in deep sleep. Okay? For some reason you think that you only exist, or you're only conscious in the presence of objects. Well, that's not true, because objects are only name and form. And if you do this inquiry where you look at objects and try to see what existence is, inquire into the nature of existence, you'll see that all the names and forms actually depend on existence to even be. So whether you're perceiving the objects, you exist and you are consciousness. When the objects disappear, such as deep sleep, you exist and you are consciousness. And so that brings us to the conclusion here, is that a man is called a brother in relation to his sister, a son in relation to his mother, and a father in relation to his daughter. But the man himself remains the same. Similarly, the self is called the waker, the dreamer, and sleeper in relation to each state of experience. The self, that which is present in all three states, remains unchanged. You are the consciousness in which these states appear. Each state is an experience. The self is free of experience, just to point that out. But each state is an experience: the waking experience, the dreaming experience, and the deep sleep experience. We've established that deep sleep is an experience. So you are the consciousness in which each one of those experiences takes place. For there to be experience, you have to be there. Now, the consciousness itself doesn't go to sleep. It doesn't dream. It doesn't wake up. It doesn't change form. It doesn't change name. The consciousness, you, remains the same, and the names and forms change. Okay? You have to be there. You have to be present and unchanged in order to say that each one of those experiences actually changes. The analogy that we're using here is that the self is simply referred to differently based on its relationship to something. Okay? So when the waking state appears, we say, oh, that's me, I'm the waker. Oh, that's me, I'm the dreamer. Oh, that's me, I'm the sleeper. Upon waking, you can say, oh, I was sleeping. But what it's saying here is that in the same way that one single person who remains the same can be called different things in relation to different objects. Okay, a man can be called a brother in relation to his sister, a father in relation to his children, or a son in relation to his parents. The man himself remains the same. So even though the self is falsely called a waker, a dreamer, and a sleeper in relation to whatever state is appearing in it, the self, you, remain the same, remain unchanged. And again, we have to admit that each one of those states exists. Okay, it may not actually exist, but it's borrowing existence from something. Okay, the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state all exist. There's never a time when you cannot be away from existence, because whatever is at any moment exists. Those objects, like I said, may not be totally real. They are apparent, but they have to be borrowing their existence from something, and that existence is you. You exist at all times. In the waking state, you may not actually be the object, but you are the essence of all objects. You are the existence, and that existence is ever present, unchanged, nameless, formless, all the time. It's the same in the dream state, and it's the same in the deep sleep state. So by this analysis, you can take the entire not self and just sum it up into 3 different states of experience. You don't have to look at the particulars. You can just say, when I'm awake, when I'm dreaming, when I'm sleeping, and you can objectify, look at all of those things, and based on all of this logic that we've already used, negate your identity with the waker, the dreamer, or even the deep sleeper, and see that you are the consciousness existence that is present and unchanged in each one of those states. Purnamidaf, Purnamidam, Purnat, Purnamadachyate, Purnasya, Purnamadaya, Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.